All right, today we're going to look at war plans once again, and our objectives will be to examine the war plans of the various major European powers, in this case, particularly France, and secondly, to understand to what extent these war plans helped to contribute to World War I. France's war plan was known as Plan 17, and the primary goal of Plan 17 was essentially to recapture Alsace-Lorraine from the Germans, which, as you know, had been lost during the 1870-71 Franco-Prussian War. At the core of Plan 17 was the notion of the French fighting spirit, or something called Élan Vital. Élan Vital was a mystical concept. It was a notion that the French possessed this unique fighting spirit that no other nations possessed, this kind of brave, courageous spirit. And this would allow them in the end to defeat the Germans, even though the Germans might be numerically superior in terms of military force. The French military leaders were indeed inspired by the writings of Ferdinand Foch, who was a military theorist, a French military theorist. And he believed that an all-out offensive strike was necessary to defeat the Germans. And that was another component of Plan 17. It was very much offensive in nature. Here we have a photograph of Ferdinand Foch, and he again is associated with the cult of the offensive, the idea that a successful military needed to be one that focused on the offensive. Here's a picture of the French commander-in-chief, Joseph Joffre, who, again, inspired by Foch, was the author of Plan 17. Here we see a comparison of the Schlieffen Plan and Plan 17. And you can see that they kind of had different goals. The blue arrows represent the French thrust into Alsace-Lorraine. The red arrows represent the German movement through Belgium into Paris. So what was the result of Plan 17? Well, like the Schlieffen Plan, Plan 17 failed. It failed for a number of reasons. First of all, when the French marched or attempted to march into Alsace-Lorraine, they failed to take into account the increase of defensive power as a result of improvements in technology. And so because of this development, when the French did go into Alsace-Lorraine, they were pushed back by the Germans. And again, a lot of this had to do with changes in technology that strengthened the defense. The French underestimated the strength of the German reserve forces, and thus they underestimated the capabilities of the Germans to put forces in the Alsace-Lorraine region, as well as to maintain a huge force that could go through Belgium into northern France. The French also felt that the Germans would be reluctant to invade Belgium because of the British promise to the Belgians to defend their neutrality. And of course, we know that the Germans referred to this as a scrap of paper, and it did not stop them, this British promise to protect the Belgians. In the end, perhaps France's greatest mistake was that they underestimated the power of the German assault through Belgium. When all is said and done, that was the big shortcoming of Plan 17. Other countries also had war plans. We're going to look just briefly at these. Austria had war plans, Plan B and Plan R. They're slightly different, but basically they involved Austria-Hungary deploying its troops against Serbia and Russia. Russia had its own war plan. The first Russian war plan was Plan G. And it assumed that in a war with Germany, that Russia would have to accept territorial losses and casualties until it was able to fully mobilize its troops. And as you know, it would take Russia a fair amount of time to mobilize its troops. At least that was the thought. And so for Russian war planners, they basically said, okay, when the war begins, we will indeed lose territory. We will indeed have casualties. But once our troops are fully mobilized, we'll be able to recover. Now, this initial plan, Plan G, was eventually changed. The new Russian war plan, Plan 19, basically takes into account that the Germans are going to fight a two-front war. And so basically, while the Germans are attacking the French, the Russians would launch an assault against the Germans. So it's a much more offensive strategy. And this will be the plan that the Russians will use at the beginning of World War One. Just as a side note, it turns out to be pretty much a disaster for the Russians. They are decisively defeated by the Germans. One important thing to note is that the Britain had no formal war plans, and again they had a very small army, and again they were not fully involved with the alliance system, and really did not have these set plans for conflict. So how were war plans the cause of World War One? Well, the fact of their mere existence may have been important. The fact that they were there perhaps meant that they would one day be used. That the great nations, the great powers, I should say, were planning for war and may have seen it as inevitable. Were the various nations prisoners of these war plans? These war plans were not very flexible. They were based on the assumption that certain things would happen, and there wasn't much flexibility. And so they may have inhibited alternate decisions or alternative decisions to war. And we'll get into that a little bit later. The fact that the French and Russians knew about the Schlieffen Plan may have been important. There was already an alliance between France and Russia. We know that. But when these two countries got wind of the Schlieffen Plan, you can't help but wonder if this reinforced or strengthened their alliance. The fact that they knew that they were kind of both the targets of Germany. The last point I'd like to make is relates to a book by A.J.P. Taylor called War by Timetable. And it's a very interesting read. And in this book, Taylor points out that all countries depended upon using railroads for mobilization. And each war plan had detailed notions about how much time it would take to mobilize its military, again, through the railroads. So everything was very intricate, very much based on timetables, and there was little deviation from this. And again, Taylor contended that these plans were inflexible and could not be adjusted. And again, what I said, just like I said earlier, basically the major powers were prisoner of their own war plans. It's an interesting idea, and certainly one that other historians have also brought forth. Anyway, that's the end of part 2.